Welcome to the Launch Capsule. With your host, James DuBos. Buckle up because your launch capsule begins now.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome to this episode of the Launch Capsule. This is Jim DuBos, and in today's episode, it's going to be the beginning of a two-part on the definitive purchase agreement. What I'm focusing on here is a high seven-figure or eight-figure transaction. As an example for this type of transaction, it's the acquisition generating a $30 million exit. And so what I want to do here is walk through the primary sections contained within the DPA to start to give you an expectation around what does this look like. So let's get started. Section 1 is simply going to be what they generally refer to as a recital or a background. And it's setting the stage for the agreement itself, identifies the buyer and the seller. It outlines the intent of the transaction. So it'll make reference to previous discussions or agreements, particularly the LOI. It'll lay out terms of obligations. It's going to provide some context that basically guides the interpretation of the agreement, summarizing the logic behind the deal. Again, it's going to identify the buyer and seller. It's going to state the intent to buy/sell the business. It's going to reference prior documents, so letters of intent, non-disclosure agreements, and so forth. And then it's going to describe the rationale, the strategic alignment or market expansion, whatever the purpose of the acquisition itself. In Section 2 is what I refer to as the purchase and sale of the business, and it's starting to define the structure of the deal, asset versus stock purchase. It is specific what is being transferred, what is excluded from the transaction, and then what are the obligations, liabilities the buyer is assuming. Honestly, this is the legal heart of the transaction, and so the precision to avoid any post-closing dispute is really important. So again, it's going to describe stock versus asset. It's going to list specific assets, IP, inventory, contracts, licensing, equipment, and so forth. It may exclude certain elements, cash, certain receivables, personal assets. It will identify assumed liabilities, the employee obligations, any contracts, taxes, and so forth. It may include a transition agreement or rehired employee conditions as a component of this. Now, in these first two sections, you're also generally going to see what I refer to as the definitions section. And a lot of the definitions are pretty mundane. They're pretty, I would say, expected. But there are going to be some definitions that you want to pay attention to. Anything related to the financial payout formula. So if there's something like an adjusted EBITDA or adjustments that are used in the actual calculation or the formula to pay out any performance-based compensation, you really need to take a look at the definition and make sure that it is accurate and that you think there's a precision that you agree with in those definitions. In Section 3, the purchase price and payment terms. So this is where you start to see the financial terms of the deal, the total consideration, how and when payments will be made. Is there any portion that's going to be contingent, earnouts or performance milestones? It also addresses any holdbacks or escrow provisions that are used to protect post-closing risks. And I'm going to talk about this here in just a second. So in this example, we're using the purchase price of $30 million, the payment structure, upfront cash, a seller note, escrow, and earnouts, and how those are defined. It specifically will talk about the escrow amount and what are the release conditions associated with that. It'll also talk about earnout metrics and periods, if any. Remember what I said about definitions. And then tax allocation of the purchase price, particularly in the case if it's an asset deal. Now, let me go back to earnouts and escrows for just a second. In the case of earnouts, as I've talked about in other launch capsule episodes, it's really important to keep that within a 12-month window or less. So any performance-based measurement needs to be based on a 12-month window. Don't go any longer. Pay attention to the definitions and the formula to be sure that it is clear to both parties. I even suggest an example representation to clearly articulate the intent behind the calculation of the earnout itself. In escrow, it is not uncommon for escrow to be held back pending the release. And so as an example, there may be a certain level of collections they want from accounts receivable. There's a certain level of potentially tax holdback. So if you had a sales tax concern or a payroll tax concern, the buyer wants to be sure that all of that is clear and resolved before they release escrow. Not uncommon. So as long as the conditions are clear and reasonable, it's not uncommon for escrow to be established. And as those conditions are met, and generally they are time-bound, met within a time period, they will waterfall out and basically be distributed to you as the owner or to the ownership group as a whole. Okay, section 4 is what I would refer to as the closing, and it just defines the logistics and the deliverables that are needed to finalize the transaction. It governs the when and how the transaction occurs and all of the necessary legal documents, the payments and approvals that are exchanged simultaneously. So things like closing date, the place, and the method. The seller deliverables, it might be stock certificates, IP assignments, resignations, and so forth. The buyer deliverables, things like wire transfers, board resolution, financing documents. If there's any filing obligations, are there any UCC or government consents that are needed? And then pre-closing actions or sign-offs that are required by any third parties based upon the due diligence outcomes. So those are all normal, I'll say, processes as part of closing. And then reps and warranties, or representations and warranties. These are legally binding assurances to basically establish trust and confirm facts. They form the basis of indemnification if there's any false or misleading statements post-closing. So sellers typically make broader reps, financials, operations, while the buyer is going to focus on authority and capacity. So some simple seller representations: you have the authority to enter into the agreement. You have a good and marketable title to the asset or shares. The financial statements are accurate and complete. No undisclosed liabilities or pending litigation. You've been compliant with all laws, permits, licenses. You have valid ownership of IP, no infringement claims. Tax filings and payments are current. Material contracts disclosed and valid. Employee lists, benefits, labor issues are all disclosed. The buyer representation: the entity is duly organized and authorized. The agreement is binding and enforceable. Financing is available to fund the purchase, and there's no existing legal or regulatory barrier to close. I will tell you that it is very common in high 7-figure and 8-figure transactions for the seller and buyer to enter into an insurance policy that is basically a reps and warranty policy. And it's not uncommon for that to be a multi-million-dollar policy. It's for typically a short period of time but it can be very expensive. And it depends on the buyer and where their funds are coming from. And it's very common to see insurance be procured to cover any reps and warranties and things that would be considered misrepresentation of the reps and warranties. So again, these components, what you're disclosing, what you're representing, the bottom line is it just simply needs to be the truth. My dad would say the good, the bad, and the ugly. It doesn't matter. The whole truth, nothing but the truth. Don't hold anything back. Don't not disclose something, because this is the area that will get you into significant legal hot water and will ultimately cost you money. Okay, so the reps and warranties is something to be very attentive to. Now, in my own experience with transactions, it is not uncommon for there to be multiple calls around reps and warranties. In the last transaction that I did, a series of, I would say, 2-3 hour sessions, and there were more than 20 people on the call asking questions around reps and warranties, just validating the various elements of the business, wanting me on record, disclosing everything as they went through the list of document areas to confirm that what we had represented was to be factual. And so that's a very common process. And that's why it is so important for you as the owner or ownership group to be transparent, build trust, make the proper representation. Okay, look, I hope this was helpful. In the next episode, I'm going to finish out the remaining 5 areas of what is contained within the DPA itself. I know that this sometimes can feel maybe intimidating in this process, but understand you have a marketable asset that the buyer wants. They just need to validate there's nothing, I'll say there's no surprises. They want to know there's no surprises. They want clarity on what they're procuring, and they want to have confidence that what they're buying is going to generate the level of return they're expecting for the transaction itself. So they're really trying to eliminate risk and validate the various financial performance aspects of the business, as well as the people in the company. Are there any surprises associated with people, whether it be employees or customers? So very common here. So like I said, in the next episode, we're going to finish out the DPA to try to give you some content and context of the agreement itself. And so I'll see you in the next episode. Have an awesome day.
That's a wrap for today's episode of The Launch Capsule. With your host and mentor to success, James DuBos. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and share.